Today we will talk about a passage account that's in Matthew. It's about a half shekel. In this passage we read an account where tax collectors question Peter if Jesus is paying his temple tax, half shekel as we call. And we read Peter's response, and then we read Jesus speaking to Peter and commanding him to catch a fish that will have 1 shekel in his mouth, collect and pay for both Jesus and Peter. This text was to maintain church work and did not interfere with biblical teaching. Rather, it was actually imposed by God in Old Testament. And because Jesus was born under the law to fulfill, therefore he let this happen and did not let this to be a discouragement for disciples and others, though this is not a big miracle, but is one of the most important one that teaches the lesson how church must function its day-to-day operations to fulfill the duties to preach and spread the word of good news. Today I want to share 3 main things that we learn in this account. Number 1 is temple text, the history and the importance of this text. And then number 2 will be managing church finance. And then thirdly, honest church leadership. So let's start with temple's text. And let's talk about the history. In Exodus chapter 30, verse 11 to 16, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life and the time he is counted. Then no plague will come to them. When you number them, each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give a half shekel. According to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerah, this half shekel is an offering to the Lord. All who cross over those 20 years old or more are to give an offering to the Lord." And in verse 15, it says, "The rich are not to give more than a half shekel, and poor are not to give less. When you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives, receive the atonement money from the Israelites and use it for the service of the tent of meeting," means where they worship together. "It will be a memorial for the Israelites before the Lord, making atonement for your lives." Jesus is in Capernaum. It won't be wrong if we call this town his headquarters. This is where Jesus mostly reside. Because of his authority and mighty works, they did not have courage to question him direct. So what they do, they ask Peter if Jesus pays his tribute. Seems this might took place in Peter's house. Now, because tax collectors and other crowd was always following Jesus, and Jews thought this was a good time to see what Jesus had to say. If he refuses to pay, then they can trap him by refusing to uphold God's own set rules. That's what they can claim. And on the other hand, they want to see what he does about this. So we read Peter answers for Jesus, and there's another setting, but we actually want to understand that this question was outside, asked by Jews leadership to Peter while Jesus was still inside the house. And Peter says, "Yes, my master pays the tribute. It is his principle and duty and practice. You need not fear moving it to him. He was made under the law, he abides the law." Now remember, this tax was imposed on Jew at the and over age 20 years and older. Now this tax paid to the temple is called an atonement for the soul. And that's what we read in Exodus chapter 30, verse 15. Christ, that is everything he might appears in likeness of sinners, paid it though he had no sin to atone for. And he let that happen. He did this to set an example what a leader should do, and also of rendering to all their dues credit to whom credit is due. And also we read about this in another passage in Romans chapter 13 and 7. Now, so that was the reason Jesus let this happen. As a captain of the team, as a leader of the church, he was setting example what leaders should do. In verse 25 to 26, we read, the kingdom of Christ is not being of this world, but church represents him on the earth. Therefore, it is important to contribute to the sport of the public worship of God in the places where we are. Now, if we reap the spiritual things, it's important and is very fit to return carnal things. The temple was now made a den of thieves, and we read this in the gospel. So chief priests and elders opposed Jesus. We know Jesus mostly preached in open areas, on the mountains, in the fields, and all that. He still went ahead and paid the tax. Now he didn't even use the temple pulpit once or twice, we read. But remember, brothers and sisters, church duty are legally imposed, are to be paid. If Christ pays his tax, then how can we pretend that we are exempted? And now here we read Peter answered and to the tax collectors, but I'm pretty sure he was still thinking how we would do this. And now, while Jesus is inside and he knows all, he's almighty, and so he tells Peter what he needs to do next, and it's nothing hidden from him. He is all knowing. He knows everything. He knows he's our creator and maker. So what did Jesus do? Jesus didn't have to pay the temple tribute, brothers and sisters, because temple is his. He owns the temple. But isn't it strange that he is paying tax to himself? He is the king, and as we read, the other kings pay him tribute or tax. But because he was born under the law, he kept the law. And one other thing we must remember, this tax was not in any way of conflict of bigger things. Therefore, Jesus decided to pay, so it's not a hinder for his team, and it doesn't make them weak in their faith. Now listen to me carefully. In these verses we read a dialogue between Jesus and Peter. When Jesus asked Peter who should be taxed, and we read, it says in second part of verse 25, this was where this conversation takes place, and is written, when Peter came into the house. Now I already explained to you, Jesus was inside the house talking with the crowd while Peter was outside when this question was posed on him. Jesus was first to speak when he entered heaven. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duties and taxes? From their own children or from others? That's Jesus asking. And 26 verse here where it says, from others. That's what Peter's answer was. Then the children are exempt, Jesus said to him. Well, what Jesus was trying to say is kings tax strangers or the foreigners whom they deal with, not to the children of kingdom. It's like parents taxing their children. That's how it kind of looks like if we kind of apply in a plain English, I would say. Jesus is Son of God, heir of all things. Temple is his, like I said. He is faithful in his Father's house. He is not obligated to pay for the service of the temple. This tax was an offering for the atone of their life. Now, Jesus did not commit any sin. He didn't need to pay the tax. Now, spiritually, God's children are fed by adoption and grace from the slavery of the sin, but still subject to civil magistrate in civil matters. Jesus is trying to teach us here. Brothers and sisters, listen to me very carefully. Jesus is trying to teach us we must render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Let's talk about how it was paid now. Now, remember, Jesus and disciples were not rich. We know they were not rich. They did not have any trust set up or they didn't have any big donor to support their ministry. Rather, they lived on alms. We read in Luke 8:3, Jonah, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Harold's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. That's what Bible teaches us or tells us. The gospel tells those noble women were supporting this ministry. We need to understand that any support that we have for our ministries, we must be honest. We need to decline ourselves and fulfill the good news. Paul sewed the tents to pay his bills. He did not use church funds. In this case, we know Judas was carrying a bag of money. Jesus could have told him to pay half shekel for Peter and half for him, 1 shekel. But he didn't. Because that was not a tax on church or on the ministry. That was a tax on an individual. And Jesus, being over 20 years old and under the law, was obligated to pay. But he didn't need to pay that because he is the God. But he let it happen. So because it was in tax on the individual Jews, that's why it's like a personal tax. It's like income tax. So Jesus did not use money that was ministry's money that Judas was carrying. It was like a personal income tax, like I said. Should I use church fund to pay my personal tax? No, I shouldn't. And that's what Jesus was trying to set example here. So what do we learn here? We must be honest with the responsibilities that church has assigned us. We must be honest. This also applies in secular areas of responsibility. It's written in the Bible, 1 Peter chapter 2:12. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So Jesus did not use church funds to pay his personal tax, and we should not either. We must be honest with the responsibilities that are given to us. We hear all kind of stories in media these days about financial corruptions, and even in churches, church leaders are involved. And our church leaders, wake up. I ask you to wake up, dear brothers and sisters. If Christ can waive his privilege to do, and we can do that too. Understand, we must never decline our duty for fear of offending someone. Jesus' preaching was offended them, but yet he kept preaching. Remember, better offend man than God. But we sure can and must sometime decline in that which is our secular interest. Now, thirdly and the last, church leadership. That's my last point that I want to talk really quick. We will examine and x-ray ourselves through latter part of the verse 27. Here is a miracle that Jesus performed, which is not that kind of dramatical, like I said earlier, and often had not even been talked about, but I see very important message hidden in this miracle for me and for you. Jesus commands Peter to catch a fish, and there shall he find 1 shekel in fish's mouth, that is to pay tribute for him and Jesus. In this miracle we see a power of Christ over all, his authority over every living creature, and proof of his divinity, second person in Godhead. He is all-knowing. He knows everything. He knew there was a fish. He knew that fish had a 1 shekel in his mouth. Only God knows these things. This is a proof of his omnipotent, that he has all the knowledge. Now watch closely why fish delivers only 1 shekel. Because they just need 1 shekel. The fish could deliver a bag full of money, But it didn't happen because they need only one shekel. This is what Jesus is trying to teach us, that we must trust in Him for our needs. We should not greed, but trust in Him and He will provide. He will take care of us. And in other words, but having enough for our current situation. He is not teaching us to live from hand to mouth, rather trust in Him for all what we need in this life. We must trust in Him for our daily needs. It's written, ask and you shall receive. Well, fish was kind of Jesus' bank. Now, I have account in Bank of America, so that was kind of Jesus' Bank of America. But some have family friends, some have family members that work in those institutions. And what do? We expect that at the demand, the bank would deliver what we have, what we are asking. And it's actually our money that the bank is delivering us. But in this case, our treasure with Jesus, in this case here, that is the message that Jesus was trying to teach us. That we must not greed, but trust in Him and He will provide for our needs. Here Jesus paid for him and Peter, teaching us to help and take care of our friends and people in need. Remember, in other words, Peter, along with other disciples, was in Jesus' employment, if I say. Jesus is teaching that we need to take care of those people that are with us in this ministry, that are spreading His word and are part of taking the kingdom to others. Peter was in employment of Jesus. By serving Lord, therefore, Jesus took care of him. We must also take care of those who are serving church in different capacity. There could be preachers, janitors, security guard. We must pay the labor. It's very important. But bigger lesson for us is we should be honest in all what He has awarded us with, spiritual talent. And in carnal things we must be honest in responsibilities that have been given to us by church or at work, at places. Just as He did, we must also depend on God. We have been promised not to covet. Jesus had a bag that Judas was carrying, but he did not use that because those were church or ministry funds. We must also be careful with the things that we have been put in charge to watch over. When you listen to this message, I want to ask you, understand our responsibilities that we have. And understand that we must be honest with those responsibilities. Because one day we will stand before Him and we would be asked and we will answer that how did we manage those responsibilities? How did we manage those responsibilities that was given to us, to not only in church but also in secular world? In the families as a father, how did we raise our children? At workplaces, were we a good witness? Did we fulfill our duties honestly? And also, as together, we work for the kingdom of God. We must understand and read about this half shekel passage. May God bless you.